I want to just start off by saying that globalization is not a new phenomenon, at least since World War II. There is a sort of a kind of popular notion around that globalization has just occurred in the last 15, 20, or 25 years, and it's just something that really happened since the 1980s. Well, that's just not true at all. What we now call globalization, which was not called globalization, was just called free trade in the earlier post-war decades, was really a pillar of post-war American foreign policy. And if you go back to the end of World War II, American policymakers were committed to freer trade than had existed in the Great Depression, which was an era of great protectionism. And the reason they were committed to freer trade was that people at the time felt that protectionism had been a contributing cause to the Great Depression, and nobody wanted to go back into the Great Depression. Unemployment in the United States during the 1930s, to remind you, averaged 18%. It averaged 18%. Even in 1939, before the war boom, it was 17%. At its height, it was 25%. So nobody wanted to go back into a depression, and there was a widespread fear among both economists and policymakers and the general public that, in fact, we would go back into the depression. So one of the objectives of American foreign policy was to get rid of the protectionist shackles that existed in the 1930s, and that, in fact, did occur during the first decades of the post-war period. Although that was the initial for free trade policies, it was not the only motivation. That as the Cold War developed, there was a sense among American policymakers that the promotion of free trade would promote prosperity in Western Europe and Japan, and the expansion of their trade would help stabilize those countries, make them more prosperous, and in effect inoculate them against the communist influence and make Western democracy popular in comparison to the appeal of communism. And so that was really the second underlying motivation for these pro-trade policies that were, as I say, a pillar of post-war American foreign policy. If you look at the statistics, in the 3.5 decades after World War II, by 1980, world trade was 5 times what it had been in 1950. So there was an enormous expansion of world trade. U.S. tariffs today, American tariffs in the 1930s averaged about 50%. Today they average less than 5%. Most of those reductions occurred before the 1980s. We've had some subsequent to that, but there were huge reductions in tariffs in the United States and elsewhere during these decades. And it was not, this expansion of trade was not just a matter of statistics. If you could transport yourself back to an era before you were born, to the late 70s and the early 1980s, Americans became conscious then of intense foreign competition in a number of industries. In the 1950s and the 1960s, Americans basically assumed that we would be the economic leader in almost every industry forever. There was a kind of national hubris that assumed that America's economic system was so superior to everybody else's that we would not face any serious competition in any major industry. Well, by the end of the 70s, that was obviously no longer the case. Much of the consumer electronics industry, and in those days what the consumer electronics industry produced were TVs and radios, most of that industry had been wiped out by Japanese competition. So that industry disappeared. Large segments of the shoe industry and textiles and apparel manufacturing had disappeared. The steel manufacturers were under an enormous amount of pressure. Car companies were becoming under pressure from Japanese companies that really Americans had not heard of in the 1960s, Toyota, Nissan, which was then called Datsun. So it wasn't just that statistically trade expanded during this period, but it entered American consciousness that we were in competition with other countries and companies from other countries. We call that now globalization. As I said, we didn't call it globalization then. We just referred to it as trade, but it was really a large part of the national consciousness at the end of the 70s, and one reason Americans, not the only reason, Americans were pessimistic about their economic prospects at the end of the 70s.